Hey everybody, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 147. My name's Dan Lizette, and thank you very much for taking just a few moments and coming back and checking out a brand new interview show. Yes, I know, 2 in a row. What was I talking about with all the concerns about new content? Nope, not right now. Well, more about that just in a moment. I got a great guest, a great conversation, and a great show for you guys this week. But before we get started, I want to take just a quick moment and thank my Patreon supporters. A couple new ones have joined on recently, and one I want to highlight, a very generous Sleep With Me podcast has joined the Patreon supporter list, and I really appreciate their support. So thank you very much to Sleep With Me. So if you have any trouble sleeping, you may want to go over and check out Sleep With Me podcast. It is on my to-do list to do so because sometimes I have trouble sleeping. And also want to thank this week's show sponsor. This week's sponsor is Podbean. They offer podcast hosting and monetization. It's the easiest way to start podcasting. If you go to podbean.com/TPD, you'll learn more and get your first month for free. I'll tell you a little bit more about Podbean as our show goes on this week. But let's get to this week's show. It's a really good one and a unique one, folks. I mentioned from the outset that not very often have I featured very many sports-oriented shows, which is a little ironic because I am a huge sports fan, truly a huge sports fan. But really intriguing sports-based stories are sometimes hard to find. But I have found one, at least in the host of Matt Talk Online. His name is Jason Bryant, and this guy's story is pretty amazing, and we dive deep into his full story in terms of how he got into sports, what brought him to a focus on wrestling, which is his primary focus, and also some amazing experiences he had. I don't want to spoil the story, but we get into it towards the end of what this gentleman had the opportunity to do at one point and what he's now doing with Matt Talk Online and podcasting in general, and has turned this into basically a full-time job / career. And it's an amazing story. Jason's a super cool guy, and I think you guys will really enjoy this story of somebody who kind of had a passion and a drive for a particular interest area and sort of has driven it all the way through to realization. And we talk about how I'm jealous in a sense because he's been able to do something that, quite frankly, the younger me would have loved to have done. So it's a great story, great conversation. I think you guys will enjoy it. But before we get to it, I just want to make one mention of coming weeks. You guys know, regular listeners know of sort of the difficulties I've had with new content, new interviews, new releases in the last month and a half or so. I expect that to continue for probably the next few months, and I'm pretty much anticipating that next week there will not be a new show, although likely I'm not sure if it'll be a solo show or a rerun. I've still not decided. But if you have thoughts on that, the podcast digest at gmail.com. Shoot me an email, or at poddigest on Twitter if you can tell me your thoughts in 140 characters or less. I'd love to hear from all of you all the time on the show and how it's going and what you'd like to hear. So with that said, let's get to this week's conversation. It's a good one. Jason Bryant from Matt Talk Online is my guest, and here's our conversation. All right, folks, welcome back. As I mentioned up front, my guest this week, a guest unlike really any other guest I've had before, which I'm super excited about. I don't know that I've had a host, creator, producer of a sports-oriented show before. So I'm going to knock that off my to-do list right now and welcome Jason Bryant from Matt Talk Online and 100 other things to the Podcast Digest. So, Jason, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dan. I've been listening to the show for probably 2 years at this point, so it's gotten me through a lot of long car rides and flights overseas, and just glad to be here with another kind of Virginian.
Yes, absolutely. We are brethren in the locality of Hampton Roads, Southeast Virginia, and all that fun stuff. So we'll touch on that here in just a second for sure. And we'll probably do so in my very first question, which is for anybody who has no idea who Jason Bryant is at this point, can you tell folks a little bit about your backstory long before the first ever podcast? Who are you? Where are you from? What were you doing way back when? And what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, the first thing I remember what I wanted to be, when they asked that question, what do you be when you grow up? Man, this is going to be a tough edit post show for you, man, because the first thing I can remember wanting to be when I grew up was a meteorologist. And I was probably second and third grade, then living in Newport News, Virginia. We moved to Pocosin, which is about 10 miles away, a smaller, little more fishing-oriented, dare I say, type of place when I was in seventh grade. But I remember watching the Weather Channel and saying, I'm going to go to Georgia Tech because I knew the Weather Channel was in Atlanta. And I was going to go to Georgia Tech and be a meteorologist. Then I discovered sports, and probably fourth or fifth grade. And that really kind of said, okay, I'm still going to do this TV thing, only I'm going to be the guy after the weather guy. I'm going to be the guy talking about sports. So early on growing up, I had an affinity for sports and the numbers that went with it. Sports radio back home. There was a guy named Tony Mercurio who was on, insert alphabet soup network here. It was WGH. Then they went
AM 1310.
It was 1310, but it started. Yeah, it was Sports Radio 1310, ESPN Radio 1310, The Score 1310. Now after I left, it became 94.1 ESPN. So Tony was a big part of me growing into being a sports fan and just the talk radio type of concept. So I was religiously calling in the show starting in like the fifth grade, Jason from Newport News. And then I moved to Pocosin, Jason from Pocosin. And, sports got infectious. It was everywhere. And this is long before I even knew what the sport of wrestling was, which is what I'm concentrating in now. But it was one of those things, and I remember the principal at BC Charles Elementary School. We didn't even have yearbooks then, but we had these little printouts that were on like the dot matrix printers, and they had name and what you want to be when you grow up. And by that time, I had known, and I said sportscaster. And Miss Hancock was her name. She walked by and goes, "Who wanted to be the sportscaster at this table in the lunchroom?" And I raised my hand, and it was something that I knew in the fifth grade that I wanted to be a sportscaster. Granted, you could kind of say that's what I'm doing now. But, there's so many different pieces that go with what I do. Basically, when people ask me, so what do you do? I usually just say broadcaster or journalist. That's usually the quick answer. But that was kind of how I just jumped into sports. It was early age. I'd missed the bus because I was watching Sports Center, trying to get those, before the 24-hour news cycle and the internet. You wanted to see those 15 to 20-second clips of, at that time, the Orlando Magic, which was an expansion team. And I'm like their logo and, Scott Skiles and Nick Anderson. I was like, yeah, there's a team. And then hockey highlights and Tampa Bay Buccaneers highlights when they would actually win a game, the 5 times a year in that era.
So where'd all I was going to ask you about which sports you were most into or teams, but Florida? Where'd the Florida sports come from?
Well, then go figure. My older sister, who's 18 years older than I am, lived in Southern California, so I'm an Angels fan when it comes to baseball. Growing up in Hampton Roads, you would know that area lacks a professional sports franchise. So right. I don't really feel like everybody in my family was Washington Redskins fans, so they were out. Because anything my stepbrother liked, I'm automatically against. He liked the Chicago Bulls. I am not going to like the Chicago Bulls. And he was tough because he would change his teams each year depending on who was winning. And it was like, You can't like the 49ers this year. You like the Redskins. You like the, his uncle played for the Dolphins. So that was, he always had the Dolphins, but always said, oh, they're my second favorite team. But actually, it was his uncle that was the linebackers coach for the Tampa Bay Bucks around the time I was getting into football. And so I kind of gravitated to the Bucks because when you're in the third or fourth grade, Bucko Bruce, the logo, you think is cool. You don't realize he's not cool until you're about 15 and you're like, man, can we get rid of this winking pirate, please? But, and then Orlando, they came in the league right around that time. They were an expansion team. I saw a game on TNT Thursday night basketball or Friday night basketball, and it was like, ooh, I like the Stars, the basketball. It was a brand new team, so I felt like, oh, this is a team I can get behind. So, with an area devoid of professional basketball, it's just one of those things. You like teams for weird reasons.
Yeah, that's for sure. I got a weird sort of orientation story. I mean, I'm original New Yorker, so 2 of the 3 major sports are, Hockey, you're out. My baseball and football are out of New York. But basketball, kind of like you, I went to California. I was like, I love Magic Johnson. I mean, Magic Johnson growing up, our age, Magic was kind of a dominant figure. He was like the anti-Michael. And so that's kind of how I ended up the Lakers. And those three teams I'm still a fan of to this day. So come at me, Internet.
Yeah, logical. Plus, we all liked Kurt Rambis. We all loved Kurt Rambis.
Those glasses. They made all of us dorks and nerds feel great. If he can get by with it, we can.
If he can play with Kareem and Magic and Worthy, why can't we?
Exactly. That's all that mattered. All right. So sports got integrated into you super early, and that's understandable. I was the same way. I, too, fell asleep to AM 1310, Sports Radio 1310. I used to listen to a lot of Norfolk Tides games, back in the day, or just Tidewater Tides back then. I used to fall asleep to those game broadcasts all the time, and Mercurio was doing those broadcasts. So I can understand the injection of sports at a young age. But I'm curious then, as you headed towards the high school days and beyond, how did this navigate? Was this kind of a steady stream into the sports broadcasting world, or did you consider some deviations?
It was a steady stream because it's funny because I look back, and if I would have stayed in Newport News, I would have gone to Menchville High School, which is one of the 5 high school. Well, then 4 high schools in the city. Now there's 5. Ferguson closed, and then they opened up Woodside and Heritage. But I'd have gone to Menchville, and looking at their facilities, as I look at it now. They wouldn't have had a student do PA for basketball with a high school that's, almost 2,000 students. All their home football games were played at Todd Stadium. We're coming up on Bill Nettles as the PA announcer at Todd Stadium. He's almost done 1,000 games in his career. I'm not going to be able to have the opportunity to do any PA at the high school football games. The indoor facilities, the baseball field, there's no PA system there. So in hindsight, it ended up being a good move to go from Newport News in the Menchville district to Poquoson because they had smaller facilities and the opportunity for them to take chances on students was a little better. My graduating class at Menchville High School would have been 670. My graduating class at Poquoson High School was 181. I'm actually coming up on my 20-year anniversary coming up next month in July as we record this. But the opportunity, there was a PA system at the baseball field. And that was the first opportunity I got to really put my desire to be behind a microphone to use, and that was my freshman year in high school. And the PE teacher and baseball coach George Yeager, he's now the assistant principal, and he said, okay, I'm going to do the book and I'm going to do the PA. And he brought one of his friends from high school, Greg Martin, who was a local DJ on stations. He would fill in for I'm trying to remember some of the guys from 2WD, Dick Lamb, and those he would fill in. Yeah, exactly. He would fill in for Oldies 95.7 and 2WD, he'd fill in for them on certain breaks, and he had the experience being behind a microphone, and he was a sports fan. So while he didn't do a whole lot of sports PA, he really did. His name was Greg Martin. He brought me in and kind of trained me just basically on microphone technique, and it really was kind of loose on the technique. It's just how to speak. Here's a script, follow that. Use your natural voice. A lot of it was a really hands-on and discovering my own style. But 14 years old in 1993, 94, getting the opportunity to say, now batting for your Islanders at Poquoson High School, that was the start of it. And then the next year, as I'm a sophomore, I had to quit playing football because we had some issues at home, and I had to find an activity in the fall. And as you might know from being in the area, the way that the districts are set up, the smaller schools are playing girls basketball in the fall, and the big schools play them in the winter because basically of gym space. So I tagged along with the girls basketball team, did their PA, did their book, then followed into volleyball season because there was always boys basketball was even as bad as we were. I think 1-22.
Wow.
1-22 my freshman year. I know the coach there. His name was Bob Baker. He was a really nice guy, but the joke was he had been the coach there for like 6 years. And he won 13 games. And it was like the baker's dozen. It was like the perfect joke. And we're getting blown out by Nansemond River by like 100 points, like 120 to 40. Wow. So boys basketball didn't really get me there. And then I discovered wrestling as a sophomore. And then other coaches are getting me to say, hey, will you announce the soccer coach, Scott Kennedy? Hey, will you announce our games? I don't know a whole lot about soccer, but yeah, sure. I'll announce and play music during the games. And all of a sudden, if you couldn't go to an event, save of high school football, which I did a couple games because Mr. Fay, our Spanish teacher, liked to do football and the boys basketball. I had to have pretty much the other sports. And if you went to a game at Pocosin High School, chances are you were going to hear my voice from 1994 to 1997.
Awesome. So after high school, was there college involved?
I would hope so. Actually, it was a lot of college involved. Matter of fact, it was 7 years of college, and it was not very far away. I looked at broadcasting schools, and Chris Berman, the nickname guy is funny. He kind of takes some flack now, but you growing up, you like broadcasters, and you want to figure out where they went to school. Syracuse is a dynamite broadcasting school. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's the list. You got to go to Syracuse, or you got to go to Brown, like Chris Berman did, or Missouri for its journalism school, or James Madison up in Harrisonburg has a dynamite broadcasting school and opportunity for student radio there. So I was looking at some of those schools, like, okay, where did the big guns go? Where can I go? And as I got older, I realized that for me to get, I felt like I had a leg up on the experience on the broadcasting side because I'd done so much PA. So I was like, okay. And then I look at these things. I was like, man, I looked at Syracuse. I wouldn't have touched the student radio station for like 3 or 4 years. My senior year, I might have had the opportunity because everybody wants to come in and everybody wants to write a column for the student paper and be a broadcaster where, there's people here paying their dues. And I ultimately chose Old Dominion, which is, 20 minutes away from where I grew up, just on the other side of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. My oldest sister started her career there. My friend had actually the guy who took me to my first high school ever wrestling match had season tickets to Old Dominion basketball, so we were over there constantly watching Oliver Purnell's teams, Jeff Capel's teams, and Wendy Larry's teams, both men and women. So I was very familiar with Old Dominion. I knew their campus radio station was small, but it would give me, again, that hands-on feel that I was kind of used to, not really having a whole lot of guidance in high school. And I had started working at the Daily Press in Newport News as a senior in high school, snagging phones on Fridays, typing up box scores and stuff. So the newspaper job kept me staying in the area, but ultimately ODU's access to being able to call men's and women's basketball and baseball and do some PA work early in my college career was ultimately a decision. Plus, I was kind of a tweener in terms of the finances. It's that you make a little bit too much to be getting all that financial aid and not enough to really afford a Syracuse or a Brown, which were kind of my two dream schools. And ultimately just end up staying at ODU, which, in hindsight, 7 years as an undergrad was quite the way to getting me where I am today. But college was where I had a lot of on-the-job training, and it wasn't necessarily about what I was learning in the classroom, but it was what the school and the opportunity did, because there's another discovery that was the internet and then the sport of wrestling, and I started announcing high school wrestling matches on the weekends too. So that took me in another direction entirely.
Right. Let me get a little deep on you here, Jason.
Go deep. Let's see. Go deep.
Much of what you've just described, I've mentioned on previous episodes. I don't think I was exactly in the same place as you, but a milder version. I used to be able to sneak up into the football announcing booth at Princess Anne High School in Virginia Beach, and I did the Powder Puff game, right?
Go Cavaliers.
I talked myself into the school principal to allow me to do several morning announcements at the school, the morning announcements in high school. And I had the same sports broadcaster dream way back in the day. I remember being 13, 14, 15 years old, watching football on TV, taking my boombox out with a blank tape, hitting record, and muting the TV and doing my own sort of commentary over the football game. And I still have those tapes. So I kind of had that dream as well. But something that was different for me up through the high school years than was you, and this is really what I want to ask you about, is that while I hated it deep down, I, for some reason, convinced myself that trying to be a sports broadcaster was too much trying to be like a movie star. And you could get stuck in a small college town somewhere, and you might make $20,000 a year, and you're going to struggle. I turned it off, and I went into business administration when I went to school. Looking back, I wonder all the time. Now, I'm 38 years old today. I graduated in 96 from high school. And I think all the time about what if I didn't do that? And now talking to you, looking at somebody who didn't do that, I wonder, did any of those thoughts seep into your mind? And if so, what was that thought process that you were able to employ to kind of push through all those worries?
I think it might be stubbornness, or the fact that this is what I've done. This is one of these things. A guy I used to work with at the Daily Press had told me, he says, you've made a career out of your hobby. And he told me that 10 years ago, and it still rings true today. But, there are times I look at the people that come through, and there's been kids behind me at WODU who I've run into via Twitter, and I'm like, okay, what are you doing now? And you're right. They're at some small college, trying to move their way up. I never had the desire to leave the industry. When I say the industry, I mean journalism and broadcasting. I did leave it, but I went to something else. 8 years at the Daily Press was really where I learned a lot about how the industry works, a lot how the wire services work, a lot simple layout, photography, deadlines. These are things that I eventually brought to the world of wrestling when I got hired full time as basically a content creator and website manager for the National Wrestling Coaches Association in 2005, because there wasn't a whole lot of that experience in how wrestling was covered. So it basically kind of reinvented itself every couple of years with technology. It's like, oh, well, I learned this at the newspaper. I'm going to try to employ this into the website. Or now, well, who says we have to wait until the end of the round to start updating results? So when we look back at, did I ever think I was going to jump off of it? I jumped off the newspaper business at the right time, because the way the industry is going now, there's actually, I think, 3 people on the desk or within the department that are still there, not counting, there's, I think, 2 writers, 3 writers, 1 guy on the desk, and then one of the guys who came in with me as a clerk. And I'd been there, I had a long tenure there for a while, but the things I learned there, but I got out because ultimately they kind of pulled me off of the sport that I had fallen in love with wrestling. So I also joke that I would probably be making 3 times what I make now if I were in another sport. I'd also have a lot more competition, because niche sport, niche audience, big fish, small pond kind of thing exists. So to go to your point about, wanting to be a movie star, I'm not in the sport of wrestling to be famous. I mean, being famous in wrestling is pretty much like, what is it? I mean, I enjoy the people I meet, and it's kind of nice to take a picture with somebody or a fan, but I don't think I ever had there was one reality check where a company I was working for when I first moved to Minnesota, it tanked. And I'm sitting there going, what do I do now? I cannot go. I had never had I had a 9 to 5 with the Coaches Association, but it was an abnormal 9 to 5 because I got to cover tournaments and stuff. But yeah, I don't think I ever said I'm going to get out of broadcasting. I was always going to find something that's going to keep me in sports. Newspaper, experience would be good depending on the market. I was here in the Twin Cities when that other startup company failed, and ultimately USA Wrestling in Colorado Springs had a position open up that was pretty much written for my skill set. So it kept me in it, and then now I'm independent. But yeah, I don't think. Because now every day I'm doing something that's different. So, and it's different than what I would have expected to be doing. I mean, I thought I was going to be on SportsCenter by the time I was 25. That's just,
Berman too.
Jay Harris from ESPN, he's an Old Dominion grad. He spoke at my graduation down there. So he was actually just featured in our alumni magazine. And, I was reading about his story yesterday, and I'm like, he kept at it. And I, has those doubts that, you had. And, I don't think I ever had those doubts though. I just knew that it's all I knew, and it's all I ever wanted to do.
And that's awesome, because that resolve leads the blissful ignorance can convert itself into a drive.
Great term. Blissful ignorance. Yes.
Yeah, can convert itself into a drive that is really unmatched by sort of the logical drive you try to apply yourself. If you just sort of say, no, this is what I want to do. This is all I've ever known. This is all I want to consider. It forces on a professional blinders that can just propel you forward, and it's great when that situation arises, especially when it ends up in a sort of successful place. But we've gotten ahead of ourselves a bit here, Jason. So let's go back just a little bit, because I want to lay this groundwork. We've mentioned it in passing a couple different times, but we talked a lot about a lot of different sports. Growing up, you're a big sports fan in all capacities. But nowadays, everyone knows Jason Bryant for the sport of wrestling. So how did this sort of all of this kind of zero in to at least a core focus on wrestling?
You're absolutely right. It was a lot of sports, because even in high school, when wrestling took a hold, and I kind of fell in love with the sport a bit. It started with simply going to a wrestling match on a Wednesday night in January of 1995. And I watched a dual meet. It helped that at the time, Poquoson was a pretty solid school statewide and on the East Coast. I mean, we'd sit there and hang with the Coxes and the Great Bridges and, the power teams in the AAA, the big schools in Virginia. And we'd go up to Northern Virginia and spank the teams up there and the Nova Classic every year. But I went to this dual meet. And my friend Terry Daniels, who's he's an alum of Poquoson High. He's a lot older, but he was just one of those sports fans that kind of goes to the Admirals and goes to the ODU games and follows all the sports, even the Virginia Roadsters for the short time they were in existence in Hampton. And I've got another story with them later. But he took me to the match, taught me a little bit about how the scoring worked. And then 2 days later, I go to the Virginia Duels, which is a giant college and high school wrestling tournament at the Hampton Coliseum, which anybody who's ever been to Hampton, Newport News area, it's that spiky looking stadium right where 64 and 664, divert from one another. So, and if you're a fan of Fish, you've probably been in the parking lot, and I mean Fish with a PH. But, I went to the Duels and, Poquoson High beat the 18th ranked team in the country, and I got hooked on wrestling there. Then as I'm announcing more wrestling, we actually had a lot more events that came to Poquoson. We would host the regionals and the sectional tournaments. So the opportunity to announce a wrestling tournament was thrown at me early. So as the opportunity opened up to announce more things when I got into college, I was familiar with how to do that. Dual meets were actually kind of boring for me to announce because I only had one mat to focus on. Tournaments, I could do 2 or 3, or dual meet type of things. I could do two or three, and I could constantly talk and follow the action. But when I got into high school, I'm finishing up high school, wrestling has taken hold. The team is number 2 in the state behind Grundy, which is out in the southwest corner of the state. And it's you could be in New York City before you can be in Grundy from Poquoson. But it's something about the sport, the guys on the team, the coaches really, Billy Ruff really kind of took me in and said, yeah. And I went out and I went out for the team my junior year, and it was basically a year and a half that was of getting the absolute crap beat out of me in the room. But something about it. I mean, I got into good shape. I wasn't even sniffing the lineup because we were that good, but it just something about the sport. I took to it. And even though the state, our baseball team made the state tournament my senior year, and we were traveling. I mean, I had a radio show with Greg Martin, who I had mentioned earlier, and Henry Ayer. It was called Matt Talk, and that was a local station on 1490 right there by Langley Air Force Base in Hampton. And that really is where it took off. And then, I get a laptop and Errol's Unlimited Internet in 1997 before I head to Old Dominion. And I said, I'm going to start a webpage when I get to college. And I started looking, I found all these wrestling stats on the internet, which I had a little bit of familiarity with by being allowed to go use the internet and sign in to use it to research wrestling websites so we could build one for Poquoson High School with a parent writing it straight in code. So it was wrestling it took me away. And then all of a sudden there was the opportunity right there just going into college to announce tournaments, and they pay you to announce those tournaments. So right. It was crazy how it just took me right there.
That's what I wanted to ask you next, Jason, because I'm hoping, fingers crossed here, we've got some general audience listeners here, regular the Podcast Digest followers and listeners that are checking out this new guest of mine. And I want to know, I think I have a general idea, but I imagine many people out there don't. When you say announcing a wrestling tournament, I have a feeling that a lot of people have a misconception in their mind what that actually entails. Can you just briefly break that down for folks? What does that mean when you were announcing a wrestling tournament?
There's a couple different ways to compete in the sport of wrestling. One is team versus team. That's a dual meet. That's your high school. It's your 14 wrestlers at the 14 weight classes against the other team. They score whatever outcome it is. So if a decision's 3 points, a major decision's 4 points, a pin is 6 points. Accumulating scores for your team, that's a dual meet. And you also often see those in dual meet tournaments where it's team versus team advancement. But the sport of wrestling is an individual tournament, and you have those weight classes, and schools have athletes in those weight classes. So they will all enter. And in a high school tournament, you will have 14 different weight classes, and 10 to 12 kids. Say if you're in the Peninsula District, however your high school district is set up, you've got 10 schools. Well, you'll have 10 athletes at this weight class, and they will wrestle each other through a bracket like you would see in the NCAA basketball tournament to get a winner. They also have consolation bracket, which is you wrestle back for third place. But basically, you win the match, you move on to the next round, and you win a match, you move on to the next round. And to do this, to facilitate this, you have to have several wrestling mats, because to do it on one wrestling mat would take forever. So oftentimes you're seeing 4 mats is almost a perfect scenario to get a 16-man bracket, because you know that there's each mat is going to take the exact same time based on the same numbers. So you're sitting there as a traffic cop going, on mat 1 at 103 pounds from Great Britain, you're calling them out, and then boom, on mat 2, on mat 3, on mat 4. And then as the matches end, you call the winner a 5-3 decision for Great Bridge on 2, and you'd come back around, and the fans would be able to follow the tournament with their bracket. You're reading the final scores. They're filling in the bracket. So, little Johnny from Warwick High School has advanced to take on Billy Smith from Princess Anne in the quarterfinals of the Eastern Regional Tournament. So there are so many moving parts to a tournament, and you're constantly looking and going. And then there's the music when you get to the finals of a real, like almost an MMA style of approach where, I used to tell the kids in the back when they were getting ready for a final, which is just one mat, they line up, and I usually would I'd play the music too. So I'd have like the Imperial Death March from Star Wars, or like Fatboy Slim's Going Out of My Head was one of my big ones. And then of course Rocky is like almost, you play that at a wrestling tournament. But I'd go tell the kids, and I'm like not much older than they are. I'm like, hey, I want you to look at him, and I want the walk of the badass. I want you to walk out there and stare your opponent down like I'm going to mess you up. And the kids just ate it up. So that's what a wrestling tournament is. There's so many different ways to do it, but in short, you're a traffic cop explaining what's going on all over a gym or an arena.
Gotcha. Okay, so just because I have a feeling some people would not understand exactly, and that's what I basically thought.
There are no ropes involved.
Gotcha. Right. No, not
there might be some face paint, but no roll.
You're basically there at the beginning and the end of the match, kind of narrating the whole tournament, the action as it goes around the gym or the arena, sort of bringing people in and kind of keeping people in on the intros and the results, and from there.
Yes, as an announcer, and I've and there's also plenty of webcasting and broadcasting and television that's gone along with that too. So I've kind of played both roles the last 2 decades.
Gotcha. Well, I want to get into the podcast. There's plenty of different things that we could talk about here, but let's start to transition. So at ODU, you start to get more exposed to the wrestling, to the announcing, and then take us from that point where you start to get more touch points, the radio station, etc. Take us to that point to your first introduction to podcasting.
Well, the sports scene at Old Dominion, their athletic administration was very gracious in letting some loudmouth, arrogant college kid who'd been there forever work for the school paper and have some access to announcing those things. I did a couple baseball games. I did a soccer game or two, and pretty much wrestling, the dual meets at the old ODU Fieldhouse, they were mine, unless I was at a high school tournament announcing on the weekend. So the opportunities really were good there, and I started freelancing for the National Wrestling Coaches Association while I'm still working. And I'm still working at the newspaper. I'm still working nights at the newspaper, writing about high school wrestling at the time. So I'm basically, and then I started the website, so which is Matt Talk Online. And then let's just be honest with you, I wasn't going to class a whole lot, and there's Thirsty Thursdays. I mean, Friar Tuck's was torn down after my first year, so I missed wing night. So was the 4400 Club, that these iconic college dive bars that were gone, but we made it work with Batterson's and karaoke night. But let's just say I was a very social being. So I was always busy. I feel like I'm constantly have to be doing something. It's like therapy for my undiagnosed ADD. It's like I that's how I do something. That's why I have 3 monitors in my office and constantly have things, my life is a giant fidget spinner, I guess would be the best way to do it.
Right.
But when I get there and I realize I'm going to graduate, and I'm still, my idea is, okay, I've graduated. I go to the Daily Press. They have an opening on the desk full time. I apply for it. It's not writing, but it is layout. It's the same job I've been doing for 8 years. And I'd feel like I'd grown into it, and I applied for it. They were surprised that I applied for it, but I got it. And 2 months later, I quit. So with no backup plan. So I knew I was freelancing for Intermat, which was the site owned by the Wrestling Coaches Association at the time. And I was living with my dad for the year after college. And my dad and I had kind of had a distant relationship. And then, my stepmother passed right before my senior year. So my mom actually suggested, hey, why don't you live with your dad after you graduate while you get on your feet? And I asked, he said, yes. So during that kind of, for lack of a better term, a gap year between your graduation and your, real job, after I quit my real job, wrestling is, okay, I got this. And then all of a sudden the guy who owned the old site sold it officially to the NWCA. They approached me to run it. So I was taking again that journalism thing. And this is where the announcing and the broadcasting kind of takes a little bit of a back seat for a couple years, because the opportunities to do PA were limited in wrestling because there were people who had been doing it for decades. And, I'd do one event for the NWCA and then can you do the results? And then when I got hired with them full time, I was managing the website, doing the press releases, keeping care of the scores, getting everything up on the site. So the opportunity to do the event at the tournament, I was still at the tournament. I just wasn't doing what I was doing earlier. So I became more of a PR, media relations type of role, and did that for 3 years. And then it wasn't until actually my last year, and so we're talking 2005 is when I went up there. 2008, I was eventually going to leave the NWCA. I didn't realize this at the time, but the EIWA Wrestling Championships, which is the Eastern Intercollegiate Wrestling Association, it is the oldest wrestling tournament in the country. It's like with Princeton and Columbia, a lot of the Ivy League schools and the service, Army and Navy are in there, and you've got your Bucknell and Lehigh, schools like that. The Eastern Powers, Cornell, as I said, with the Ivy League. That tournament came to Franklin and Marshall College, which is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is where I lived. I lived about 3/4 of a mile from it. I asked my employer, hey, they want me to announce the tournament, because I had started announcing their F&M dual meets, and they were horrible. I mean, they were a Division III school with a Division I wrestling program. They were just bad. I mean, they hadn't had an NCAA qualifier in like 12 years. They were just one of the worst teams in Division I. I'm announcing their dual meets, and their coach, assistant coach Mike Catullo, who's now an assistant coach at the University of Maryland, is like, hey, we're hosting the EIWAs here. Do you want to announce? And I'm like, yeah. So that was kind of like the door to get me back into it. And I knocked it out of the park. I was working with this other woman, Natanya Levioff. She does a lot of the Navy matches. She'd been doing the EIWAs for a couple of years, and we, had the male voice to female voice, both know wrestling, and that really kind of got that fire burning again. And then shortly thereafter, I was approached by Jay Robinson, who was then the coach at the University of Minnesota, and he wanted to bring me out for this thing he was starting called Wrestling 411. And that is where I discovered podcasting. So
hold on 1 second, Jason, if I could interrupt your story 1 second, because I think I know the answer to this. I just want you to sort of confirm, and I want folks to understand everything you're describing up to this point. And please correct me if I'm wrong. When you're talking about announcing these tournaments with these smaller schools, and there's this, that, and the other, at best, in terms of money, I don't want real numbers, Jason, but we're talking side jobs, right? We're not talking mortgage or bills or family raising income here, right? We're talking side jobs at best, yes?
Right. My full-time job was with the NWCA, which I was as their director of media relations, which 10 years ago, as a single guy living in Amish country, the money was fine. The announcing stuff was side job. So when I would announce this term, this was a side job. And the hard part with the side job, working in wrestling for a wrestling company, was trying to do your real job at the same time as doing the side job. And that was really hard, because I would have to try to update the brackets during the break for the fans that were, subscribers to the website, or, it was just that balance. So yes, that was completely side jobs.
I just wanted folks to understand, because sometimes, and I know this from, coaching a little bit and little other things that I've done, that to hear you talk about it, there's a potential misimpression that people may get that says, wow, that's awesome. No, this is kind of like side jobby type work, right? This is not necessarily paying your mortgage per se at this point in the process.
Right. But in college, though, where it did, though, is because there was a time where my grades suffered, and I had to, kind of man up basically and pay my own way for a couple years. And while the money wasn't like super crazy for a college kid,
right,
getting $300 a weekend to announce a high school wrestling tournament was awesome. And I had got to the point where I scheduled my classes. I didn't take a full load in the second semester, because I'd have to be gone Thursday to travel to an event. Friday, I'd announce. Saturday, I'd announce. I'd come back Sunday. I'd have money. I'd take 1 or 2 classes maybe in the spring semester. I'd load up in the summertime to try to catch all that back. And I would never take classes before 11 a.m. once I figured that out, because I was working nights at the newspaper. So being able to figure out how it all works is the key. But yeah, I mean, for a college student, $300 for 2 days work is great.
Hey, that's 2 weeks check for your classmate who works at Wendy's. So
yeah, it's also you make sure that it's Long Island specials at O'Sullivan's. All right, we're there.
There you go. All right, I diverted you. Let's get back. The first time you found out about podcasting.
So it was in 2006. I'm working for the NWCA, and Eddie Goldman is a journalist out of New York City. He covers combat sports. He has been with boxing and grappling and jiu-jitsu. He had Grappling Magazine for a long time. He's kind of his podcast is No Holds Barred. The tagline, he's the conscious of combat sports. And I stumbled across his show, and I was like, oh, there's a player here. Click play. In the meantime, I'd been putting out interviews in part of what is our membership or premium service and using like Windows Media Player to encode them. They were behind a paywall. They weren't podcasts. We would work with another wrestling organization to get a featured interview for our premium service subscribers. Well, Eddie had this thing, and it was a weird looking player, and I clicked play. I'm like, oh, this is cool. And I think he was using Podomatic back then, and he still is. But I was like, oh, I didn't even know what it was, but that was I remember that being the first podcast I listened to. To understand what a podcast was, we jump ahead to when I moved here to Minnesota the first time with the wrestling coach Jay Robinson, who wanted to create this company. And the idea behind this company was a multifaceted, multi-angled approach to wrestling coverage. We were going to have a television show. We were going to have weekly radio shows. We were going to be on site at the biggest wrestling events doing remotes. And we were going to be able to put the archives of these radio broadcasts streamed live on the internet. And we would also, like I said, put the archives up. That's when I discovered what I was doing was podcasting, because all of a sudden on the website, which was a WordPress website, we're figuring out, I see this iTunes logo. I go like, wait, is this thing a podcast? Because I don't know how I knew what a podcast was. I just knew that I had iTunes. That was the icon, that and the streaming radio stations and podcasts. So I'm like, well, I don't have an iPod, like a lot of people say, right? Even today, they don't have an iPod. I can't listen. But I was like, okay, podcast. I was like, we're in iTunes? Sweet. And it was like 2 months into the Wrestling 411 gig. So that was the first time I realized I was podcasting before I even actually realized that I was podcasting in November of 2008.
Hey, folks, let me interrupt this conversation just for a quick moment. Tell you about this week's show sponsor. I think you're going to like them. If you've not heard of them before, it is Podbean. Podbean offers podcast hosting and monetization and all the features and then some that you could ever possibly want to make a home for your podcast. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I might want to do what Jason Bryant's doing, or I love the podcast digest. I want to talk about something as well. Well, Podbean's a great place to get started. They're going to set you up with a website. It's just like a blog, customizable themes, colors. You're going to be able to share to all the social networks and have embeddable players right there in your blog post. Even recently, they added sharing to YouTube. So a lot of people listen to things on YouTube, right? You've heard about people who will listen to music on YouTube. Well, you can listen to podcasts on YouTube. Podbean will allow your show to be right there in the YouTube library as well. But if you already got your site, it can integrate with that. It gives you all the support you need for RSS and iTunes. You can actually explore mobile application opportunities for both Android and iOS. You'll be part of their online directory. They promote shows regularly. You get all the comprehensive podcast statistics that you could ever possibly need. They've got monetization options that are increasingly popular, folks. Creating and selling premium content is super easy with Podbean. If you want to say, let's say you're coming up to the holidays and you want to say, I'm going to put together a Christmas spectacular, and maybe I'll ask folks to pay 99 cents for it. Podbean has all the existing infrastructure to help you do exactly that. That's super cool. They also have their own patron program. So if you want listener support directly from them to you, Podbean, again, has all the tools that you need to be able to do that as well. It's an amazing service, folks. And if you are looking for a new home for your existing show, or you're, more importantly, maybe thinking about starting your own, add Podbean to your list of things to investigate and go to podbean.com/TPD for the podcast digest. That will give you there all the information, as well as get your first month for free. So you can set it up, launch it, take the tour, kind of check things out, see if what I'm telling you works for you. And if so, your first month is for free and you're good to go with an amazing service. So check them out, podbean.com/TPD. And my thanks to Podbean for once again supporting the Podcast Digest. Now, back to our conversation with Jason Bryant. Yeah, and this is really years before it starts to hit, the mainstream lexicon, if you will, what a podcast is, and way before sort of some of the biggest hits people know nowadays. So.
Yeah, I'm way before This American Life, people. Come on. I've actually got that show still there. I actually reposted all the archives, and it's sitting on my domain as an archive show. And I go back and the sound quality is awful,
terrible.
It was in a radio studio, but I mean, it was just the wiring. College radio stations, the way they're wired are just horrible because there's no technician to fix this. It's some college kid, and it's like a bzzz, and the phone line switcher, you'd had to turn our mics off just to hear them talk and hit them on and ask a question, off, on. You can hear these clicks on the soundboard constantly. And then we finally moved to the basement of the house where I was living at and did things via Skype and Nicecast. But man, those early shows were they were audibly horrible.
Well, looking back, I imagine we all can say, hey, those early things. I mean, my early episodes here on the Podcast Digest were only at the end of 2014, and they were horrible. So I can imagine the arc of improvement that you can see when you're looking over that many more years in terms of progress. I can only imagine. So, but this was only a seed planted to what ultimately people will find today when they go to matttalkonline.com, link in the show notes, folks. How does it come from those early beginnings to ultimately a lot many more shows, a network, so on and so forth? What happened next?
Well, after that company, as I said, that was the company that tanked after a year. So I was here in Minnesota for 18 months. At the time, I met my wife, now soon-to-be wife. So that was nice. And it was also nice that she was fiscally responsible, if you catch my drift. So
the adult in the room.
Yes, the adult in the room with the not quite 30-year-old who has realizing the company that he moved halfway across. I moved across the country 6 months after I bought a house in Pennsylvania. Okay. Did not think this through very well, mind you. Okay. And it took me 2 years to sell that freaking place at a tremendous, tremendous loss. If anybody's ever seen The Money Pit with Tom Hanks and Shelley Long, which kind of is right around, we were probably really, it was like 84, 85. We're probably too young to be watching it on HBO, but if you're familiar with that movie, that was my house. It was just nice. One thing after another. But so the opportunity comes up at USA Wrestling, and they're trying to launch their webcasting platform. And they worked with this company that was just they were nice people. They cared about wrestling, but their product worked maybe 1 out of 10 times. And it was so frustrating to the wrestling fans that we want to watch this event, and it never works. So when I went in there, first thing I did is made sure, does that contract with that company expire? Yes? Okay, good. We're going to use Ustream. And we had I was just putting cameras up, and we made it work. And my uptime was fantastic. And that opportunity kept me back into broadcasting, because I was the voice of, the matches. So we'd have 4 streams going with 4 different mats, and I'd have the featured mat, and we'd bring in one of our board of directors was the play-by-play guy for Bowling Green and their baseball and football team. So, and he had a wrestling background, so he would handle another mat and our big events. And I became kind of a voice again of broadcasting for wrestling. Again, the PA stuff still wasn't really there a whole lot, and the podcasting thing really didn't resurface until probably 2010 when I said I'm going to start a USA Wrestling podcast. Wrote my own code for that, but that job, we got the streaming thing situated, and again, I can revert back to the podcasting thing. I was like, okay, now that I knew that Wrestling 411 was a podcast, I want to do a show. We have access to all these great Olympic athletes where I was at. So it would be, they're coming through the office, sitting down on my desk all the time. I'm like, I'm going to do this. And I wrote my own code. I didn't really, the only thing I did research on was try to find stats. So I got a Blueberry stats account, and then wrote my own XML that I basically stole from Rob Walsh's XML RSS feed code. And matter of fact, some of my code still had the hidden the comments tag with podcast 411 in it. And that was the first podcast that I actually consider that my first podcast, even though Wrestling 411 was a podcast. I didn't know it was. I didn't set it up to be that way. and being able to write your own code and do the research and then realize, oh, I'm actually using a WordPress site. I'm going to start throwing this in here. And it was self-hosted, and that was the first of
this
the...
was Matt Chat?
Yeah, USA right? Wrestling's Matt Chat, which ran for
31 episodes, if I'm looking at the right thing here.
Yeah, and you can see where I was busy and where I wasn't. Because I tried to do it weekly, and then there's another player in the space at the time that was trying to... Basically, it was like that kind of came on when my coworker and I at Wrestling 411 would put out a press release, here's who we've got on the show. They'd run out and do the interview with those people the same day and post it on their website the same day, kind of trying to undercut us. And that really, really got problematic, because it's like, how are we supposed to promote who we have when people are just cherry picking the guests? So, and you take some of that stuff personally. I mean, content is king. And, ultimately now I have the idea of like, I don't really care if I have a duplicate. Matter of fact, if somebody's on my network, I will say, all right, you've got them. I'll wait a couple weeks, because I don't want to basically have the same guests the same week on the same network. But when you come out, and then that still happened when I was at USA Wrestling. So it was just kind of comical to see it still continue. And then ultimately those 31 shows, they were pretty good. Gary Irvin, who was on The Amazing Race, he just finished climbing Mount Everest a couple months ago. He's going to come back on Short Time here soon, which is my flagship show now. And, Matt Hoover from The Biggest Loser was there. Greg Warren's a stand-up comic, in addition to Olympians and world champions that are walking through the office. So the Matt Chat was really kind of the first foray into understanding the technology behind it and understanding what the potential reach is. Liberty University cut its wrestling program. I got their AD and their senior athletic advisor on the show to talk about it, and it was the first chance you really had to, like, it wasn't on radio. It was like click play, and I was using Google Player, and like I said, I didn't even know how it all worked. I just knew that was my first one. And that's one I'm actually glad that it's still sitting there in the archives, because there was a lot of interviews there that, of the 31 shows, was just a lot of fun to really kind of really wet the whistle of what podcasting was for the wrestling community.
And after that, were you sort of enthused? Were you sort of like, okay, now I've got sort of the idea of what this can do, what this can be, and then is that when things started to sort of spread out?
A little bit, because ultimately, I've said ultimately like 15 times, so there is actually no ultimate. I'm using that.
Lots of ultimates.
A lot of the Ultimate Warrior. No, the situation presented itself where I was leaving USA Wrestling after almost 3 years, right after the Olympics in 2012. My wife and I had our first daughter, and she had some medical issues. So we made the decision to move back to Minnesota, where she was from. And the intent was to still work for USA Wrestling, but try to do it remotely from Minnesota, because her family's here. She went to college, 10 minutes from where we grew up, or where we live now. And then Amateur Wrestling News and this site called The Open Mat came knocking at my door saying, hey, we're going to merge. We're going to join forces. We want you to be a part of it. And I'm like, well, I can do it from here. I'm independent. I'm not tied to a governing body. See, if you work for USA Wrestling or you work for the National Wrestling Coaches Association, you're the man. And, people love to hate the man, right? You're part of the big bad guys that are holding wrestling down because they control everything. Well, websites that aren't tied to those organizations feel like they gave me another voice, and I started a show there in very much the same manner I did with Matt Chat, only this time we had a WordPress site. Check. I knew what PowerPress was. Check. I had a Blueberry hosting account. Check. This one was like, okay, I'm going to do daily updates. I wasn't going to make it an interview show. I was just doing like news blips, like ESPN, 2020 updates on the hour, like, tonight in Boston, blah, 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 blah. That's the intent of that show. And then that started to morph. And then the season ended. And I'm like, well, I guess I got to do some interviews because there's no more news to do.
Nothing else to do.
and I've said this story a couple times, is the light bulb went off. And I'm driving to Madison, Wisconsin for the U.S. World Team Trials, which is a tournament that determines how the United States sets its wrestling lineup for the World Championships. The World Championships take place every year except in Olympic years. And when there's an Olympic year, it's obviously the Olympics. So I'm driving and I've got Sirius XM radio and I'm listening to college sports, and it's like the College Sports Nation. It was like college coaches show after college coaches show after college coaches show. And I'm like, we can do this in wrestling. Wait a minute. I can do this in wrestling. And that was like the lightning bolt that realizes I can charge people for me to do it for them. It was like, wait a minute. Because try to do this at a radio station and their costs, and try to find somebody that's got the knowledge of all these other teams in sports. And it's like, it's really crazy that, I mean, I think the value, I know this isn't the crux of the point, but I realized, wait a minute, I can provide a service. I can have clients, as many as I need or as few as I need, because the amateur wrestling news, that company was starting to break up. And again, I can't find myself caught in the middle. I'm like, okay, how do I make the best out of a bad situation? And that was right when that lightning bolt hit. And I was like, okay, business model. What is it? I'll shoot from the hip, make a couple calls, see if people think it's viable. My wife said, go for it. And, got 3 clients right off the bat. And I'm like, okay. Then when that first check came in, yep, it was real.
And that's something that I definitely want to touch on, because this is one of the most unique things about sort of what you're doing today in the podcast space. And there's other things I want to talk about with the network and other shows and so on and so forth. But this hits on one component I do want to touch on just a bit, which is the idea of, and correct me if you're not comfy with this term, but I sort of looked at it as almost independent contractor podcasting in a sense, where you are offering your knowledge, your background on a particular topic and hosting and knowledge of the podcast space to be able to deliver sort of a ready-made product to somebody who has no touch point with the market as currently, they currently don't have any offering, a particular school or program or whatever the case may be. And this is unique in a sense. I know there are others doing it, and I know that it's a thing, but this seemed early on in the timeline, if you will, of the arc of podcasting as we now know it. And I'm wondering, like, sort of, what's this been like? Because this is something that's still actively going on for you today, yes?
Yeah, and I honestly, I kind of got, my eyes got real big, or as the saying goes, your eyes get bigger than your stomach when you eat too much. It's like, I kind of had that, how many shows can I get? And I'm starting to piece my calendar together. Like, okay, how many interviews can I do in a day? Can I John Lee Dumas this and do it twice a week? And how many times can I just, okay, Monday's my day. I'm going to batch 8 different teams, 8 different shows. It was I was a little hyper aggressive in my thought process, and thankfully, again, there's the wife that's the grounding presence. Because no, and actually had a coach.
If you were a single guy, Jason, what would be happening right now?
I'd be doing instead of doing 18 shows as my main package, I'd be doing like 1 a week. I'd be like, you get 52 shows for the same price. No, it is just. And actually, it was a coach that summer. I was at the Junior Nationals in Fargo, which is a big tournament where I actually is basically, instead of coverage now, is now a marketing trip. I'm talking to him about the idea, and he goes, no, charge this amount, because athletic directors, and they like round numbers. Don't say it's 2763. So all you people out there putting a 97 on the end of your price tag, okay, yeah. Big money people aren't looking at a 97. They're looking at a nice round fat number. Yep. Like 6,000 is not a round fat number to them. 5,000 is a round fat number. So, how much is it? 5. Well, okay. How much is it? 10. Okay. Not 1322.
Right.
So
right.
That's one of those things that when I get that in mind, and it's like, okay, and this is 2014 that I finally realized I'm going to do this. And like you said, 3 years down the line, it's amazing where it is, but it's getting that first one on the hook, to realize that, okay, you're right. One, your terminology is great. Independent contractor podcasting. The difference that I'm doing here is I'm not looking a whole lot to get out of wrestling. Now, I have interests other than wrestling. There are other topics I want to do podcasts on outside of wrestling, but it's not like, to a Podfly or any of these audio editing solutions or Emerald, whatever, the companies that do podcast editing. That's not my market. That's not what I'm going for. I've got that, and I'm hosting it. And you get the voice of, which I've basically become a voice of wrestling over the last 20 years. So you get all those things packaged together, plus a pretty good distribution, because now if you're on my show, you're on my network, and boom, you get blasted out. New shows get sent out to the people that subscribe to the new network. So as I'm going every different direction with my answer here, but yeah, it's
well, that's good.
It's just, I get so excited talking about it because
It gives me a segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, Jason, which was you mentioned network. Matt Talk Online is now way more than what it once was as an early site back in college. It's a totally different thing. It involves a little bit of what you were just describing, but so much more. So what is Matt Talk Online as currently constructed today?
What it is a giant collection of wrestling-centric shows that are tied together. Some of them, 10 of them that I host myself, and then there's other shows that I've worked
10.
with other organizations. Yeah, 10.
10. I just want folks to understand. You host 10 shows.
Not 8 are very active. One I haven't done. One is more of an a la carte kind of thing. It's like more of a grata. It's like, okay, for our state association back in Virginia. One is somewhat. They're not seasonal. I haven't done any seasons. Even though I broke one show, I numbered one show as a season this year, which I think I'm going to get away from. Once I hit the third season ending, I'm going to go back to whatever episode number it was.
Tried it, didn't like it, huh?
Yeah, it's 3-13. It just doesn't work for me. But anyway, so what you see on the site now is you will get 20 active shows, 10 that I do myself, 8 that I'm very, very active in doing, and you have 3 retired shows. So you get 23 different podcasts. One of them, a couple of them are in one feed, like a new company that's come on board, Track Wrestling. I actually started out just simply going, oh, you're putting audio on the internet? Stop what you're doing. Let me help you make this a podcast. I've done that with a couple different people, but like, whoa. You want to stop. Do not put that .mp3 link. Stop. You want this, and you're go to Libsyn, go to Spreaker, go to Blueberry. Here, let me help you. And then I've kind of gotten them, and they're like, somebody would pitch a new show, and I'm like, well, if you want to be on the network, that's fine. It's a lot of stuff that some people want me involved in helping kind of oversee their account, or they're just like, hey, you'd like to be on the network? Sure. It's not like I'm a little different from Glenn the Geek. For those of you familiar with the Horse Radio Network or his shows, I think there's a fee for you to be on this network. I'm working through ideas on other ways to monetize. But back to your initial question, I'm like I said, I'm totally ADD. We've got all the shows. I have a blog I periodically write. I did more of that during the Olympics because I couldn't do a whole lot of audio down there because of my contract with the IOC in that regard. But I also have a sign up for a daily email wrestling newsletter because I aggregate and curate a lot of wrestling news that I was used to doing, and I still do it. So I figured, okay, well, here's something that wrestling fans can get by simply signing up for an email list. I have all the college wrestling scoreboards and schedules, and this is something that the reason I do it is because nobody else does it. Now, there's other sites that have the results, but I just have a list. Here are the results. Here's the score. Here's the link. And I also have college wrestling standings, which you can't find anywhere else. So those are some other non-podcasting things in there, and digital preview guides. I've put out various publications designed for iPads and things of that nature, using my layout experience from the newspaper and my knowledge of how the stats work and digital media. So there's a couple things that you can purchase on the site, but the lion's share of it are the podcasts. I actually use an Appendipity theme because it works really well with my sites, and I have other sites that are the shows on it kind of use the same theme. It's kind of cloned, and do some hosting, and you get a lot of wrestling content on the website.
This blog, these guides you're referring to, and obviously the 8 to 10 shows we've discussed, is all of this your sweat equity?
Yes.
That's extraordinary because, like you said, there is a ton of content on here that I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, for example, the NCAA preview guide, that is kind of like my baby when it comes to March. That's 200 and something pages. Every single result for the college season of all the 330 wrestlers who qualify for the Division I championships, every single one's in there. Their picture, their record, their hometown, their high school, and then I've got history upon history. It's like basically the bar bet Bible. It's like, oh, no, dude, Melvin Douglas won it in this year. No, I didn't. Well, look it up. Here, I got it on my phone. That's the type of stuff that it solves all these bar bets too. So, and I like the stats and the history, and it's hard to find some of this stuff, and I've acquired it and accumulated it over the years. I'm like, well, I'm going to present it in something for our biggest, the college wrestling season's biggest event. And it's an event that draws, 18, 19,000 people for 3 days. 3 days. It's not a small event. It was in Madison Square Garden 2 years ago. So basically it's an accompaniment to what you do. And I actually made a pretty decent chunk of money on it. Kind of, it's a digital download. If you want to print it yourself, it'll cost you $30 at Kinko's. But it's
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's not cheap to print that thing out. And I provide 20 of them for ESPN. ESPN pays me to print up hard copies for them, so their broadcasters have it. So basically it's become what was initially an idea, and I put it out with like 60 pages. Then I amped it up and made the layout better, and it cost me a couple $100 to print those things up. ESPN goes, yep, here's your reimbursement, and you're off to go, and they love it. They love it. I've actually had Adam Amin, who is the, he's a voice of a lot of sports now on ESPN. He did the NCAA championships for ESPN the last several years. He didn't do it this past year, but he goes, dude, he told the new guys, like, you got to have this book before you even start. So when ESPN wants your stuff and they appreciate your stuff and they pay you for it, it kind of makes that sweat equity also work. In addition to the fact that I help so many wrestling fans with, their little fantasy leagues and their pick'em contests,
right.
Being like, well, hold on. No, it's at their fingertips. So,
well, that brings you all the way back to the, the kid in the bedroom on the ESPN Radio 1310. Now you get a check from ESPN. I mean, the circle is complete at this point, Jason.
It's strange. Yeah, it really is, because all of that started.
You're just one step away from Berman.
I'm about 3 billion nicknames away from Berman.
Well, he has now, mostly retired, I guess they're saying right now. So, you would think there's a seat available. That said, there's been all these layoffs, so maybe not. I don't know.
You know what? Here's the one thing of those out there that are, I don't consider myself an entrepreneur. I know that's basically what I am, but I just, sometimes you get into the podcast space and there's, we all know there's 900 shows out there about interviewing entrepreneurs, and there's 900 shows with the tagline on fire or top whatever, or, you're kind of recycling the same content. I don't want to be in that world, yet it's kind of what I'm doing. Like I don't. It's great working for yourself. Sometimes the boss can be a jackass. Sometimes he's a great guy. Oh, wait, it's the same guy. So
yeah. It's you. Well, look, Jason, I cannot let you go without bringing up the one topic that a lot of people probably have heard of you from at this point, which was, of course, the Olympics.
I thought it was going to be my roller derby experience. I know Brian, the real Brian, was into that.
That's second. And that is, you mentioned it briefly in passing, and that's not really doing it justice. And I want to make sure we do that. And I want to phrase my question in two ways, which is, one, how the hell did this happen? And two, were you freaking out? Okay, those are the two questions. And then you can take it wherever you like from there.
Oh, okay. So here it is. We're almost a year gone by since Rio. And I was I announced the Olympics. Okay, I went from, as I told you at the beginning of the show, how it all started at that little press box above the baseball field in 1994. And I'm looking at a newspaper article on my wall from the Daily Press from 1996 at the press box at Poquoson Middle School where our football team played. And it says, Poquoson High Senior announces area games, wants to be broadcaster. 20 years later, the Daily Press did another story about me announcing in Rio, and I look at it, and I'm like, in 20 years, I went from a press box in this little swamp gas town, which I love so much, of Poquoson, Virginia, with the town bird as a mosquito, to announcing the Olympic Games. Okay, I don't know how to really put that in perspective, because it was freaking cool. Dealing with the politics of in Olympic Games and transportation. Yeah, there are things that made things uncomfortable. I lost my luggage for 3 days because I decided I was flying to Rio the day Delta had their computer shut down on August 8th. Yeah, I was one of those people. So sprinting through Atlanta Jackson Hartsfield Airport was not the greatest way to start my Olympic experience. And thankfully, the clothes that I bought down there were actually still fit. But it's the quick story is right place, right time, knowing the right people. But none of that happens without starting, now batting. None of that happens without going to a wrestling match. None of that happens by if I go to Brown or to Syracuse, does that happen? I don't think so. All these things are set in motion. It's a giant and I didn't know which way the dominoes were going to fall for me. So when I got to be the soundtrack for the sport I love at the pinnacle of its sport. So say if you're an NBA fan, the pinnacle is what we just recently saw, the NBA Finals. Well, that's got, the Olympics, okay, but the NBA Finals are bigger than Olympic basketball.
Right.
So it's like the World Series is bigger than the World Baseball Classic. We know that. Mm-hmm. In wrestling, the Olympics is it.
Right.
And when you're the guy granted, there were three of us, French, Portuguese, and English, but from an American's perspective, and then you see something like Kyle Snyder become the youngest American wrestler to win a gold medal at 20 years old. He's still in college, and he beat these monsters from across the world. And then Helen Maroulis becomes the first American woman to win a gold medal in wrestling. A lot of people don't even know that women's wrestling is an Olympic sport. It's been since 2004. Helen was the first one. She's 24 out of Maryland. Great kid to be. And I've known her since she was 16. So when you see something like that, and there's people and I think I get caught up more in the event itself versus what I was doing at the event, because you're sitting there and it's not, you don't sit around at the table going, yeah, hey, we're at the Olympics, man, this is cool. No, you've got work to do, and it's stressful, and there's arguments, and there are people that don't do things the way they should, and there are people that do things the way they should, and then there's the politics, and then there's the transportation, the mosquitoes, Ryan Lochte being a complete jackwagon.
Yeah.
It affected a lot of things. So yes, it was an amazing experience, and it's really one that's hard to it's really kind of hard to put into words, even though I'm very verbose right now.
What about the butterflies, right? See, I've been a mobile
every
DJ
time, every
forever,
time.
And I always say before I do introductions for a wedding, if you don't have a little bit of butterflies before you start, that means you don't care. And the butterflies mean you care about what you're about to do. I can't even imagine the scale of that feeling prior to your first announcement at the freaking Olympics. What was that like?
What is it's like, don't screw up. What do they say? Hey, here's your advice. Don't, there's another word that they use, but I'm not sure the explicit rating on your show or not, but it
goes back and forth.
The first one was simply a welcome. It's like, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Karaoke 2 here in Rio de Janeiro for day one. You're off to that. And once it starts, you're not worried about it, but you're right.
Then you're in the
zone. Every time before a high school regional final, I'd get that tightness, the knot.
Yep.
At Churchland High School and Oscar Smith High School back in Virginia, that's where we had the Eastern region. I'd get that knot. Right before the state tournament I announced in Northern Virginia, when I'd come down I'd get that knot. Right before the EID, I get that knot. Sometimes you're too busy to get that knot, or you don't realize it's there, and then you take a deep breath and you're like, you touch your chest and it's like boom, 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 boom.
Yep.
This past weekend I announced the World Team Trials in Lincoln, Nebraska, and there 5,000 people watching the wrestlers that are going to represent the United States. The place was packed. It was loud, and I had a producer next to me. We had two announcers, and then it's to the point where we got the cues. We don't have time to think. I think this past weekend was the first time I was like, wait a minute. Oh yeah, you're right. The butterflies were there. I was just too busy to think about them because you had a team. We had a team. When you're by yourself, I think you can have more of those butterflies be apparent versus everybody else. Okay, you need to do this. There's a lot of delegation with announcing a tournament, especially when you're by yourself. It's a lot of work. You can okay, I gotta get this. Okay, is the CD player right? Is we good? Okay, we're playing. Okay, are we ready to start? We're ready to start. Are the kids coming? But this is exactly how I'm speaking. That's how fast I speak when I'm nervous at that. Versus, okay, cue red, and then I wait for the red announcer. And in the blue, from the Titan Mercury Wrestling Club, boom, I'd hit it, and once we're done, all the air comes out of your system. You're like, oh man, that was awesome. So yes, the butterflies are every time. And then the payoff at the end of the day, when you make that last announcement, and it's just like freaking sweet, and it's always better as a sports, PA announcer when the action means you actually have to talk less.
Right.
You don't really want to be the only voice talking in a very boring sporting event. This past weekend, for example, was amazing. The high drama injuries. We had, guys ranked number one in the world not making the team. We had Olympic champions, battling other big time medalists. It was just that type of sport, it makes it easy. But yes, the butterflies are there. You're leaning, you're kind of following, you're leaning out of your chair. You're like, is it going out of bounds? It's just so much, especially when it's a sport you actually care about.
The last question I got for you on the Olympics. One last question on the Olympics, because we could have done the whole episode on it.
We probably could. And I could probably talk 5 hours about that.
But one last question, because I would worry about this, imagining myself in your shoes, which is the hangover. Going to like the Lincoln, Nebraska event you just mentioned, is there a hangover effect where you just sort of scaled the Mount Everest of wrestling announcing, PA work, announce broadcasting? I mean, how do you get yourself back up, so to speak, for other things? I mean, do you even feel a little less, I don't know, internally satisfied at the process of others, or is not the case?
1 month after the Olympics, I announced a youth tournament in New York. How does that make you feel?
That's the question I have for you. I mean, were you even into it? I mean,
yeah. Oh, you're into it, because now there's certain things that I have on my resume now that people are now expecting a certain level. So, I spent so long trying to say that, hey, I'm ready for, I think I can announce the NCAAs. And now the NCAAs, which to me, I think they're more pressure filled than the Olympics, because you've got 18,000 people. You have a very, very knowledgeable fan base. There's 2 announcers, and they're both speaking English. And then you have the NCAA, which has a playbook of this, and you deviate from their script. You got to be, you're in such a regimented atmosphere. And then they let you have a little freedom when you're free forming the action, but the stress level, the hangover, I don't know. When people bring me to an event, I want them to get what they expect. And, at the Olympics, it's not all colorful. You're basically calling the action as it happens. And trust me, when there's 2 big Mongolian dudes stripping down to their skivvies at the Olympic Games, you're not saying a whole lot. You're just saying, you're just sitting there being quiet, waiting for this crazy situation that made international headlines to just dissipate so you can move on to the next match. But yeah, there's some events, some events are bigger than others in stature, but you know what? I love announcing wrestling. I love podcasting about wrestling. I love podcasting, period. I like talking to people about podcasting. There are more podcasts I listen to about podcasting than there are podcasts I listen to about wrestling. And I just try to be able to merge the things that I love together. And I've been able to do that with wrestling, announcing, podcasting. And the hangover, it can't exist. The hangover exists is when you're going 5 weeks in a row. I went from the Pac-12 tournament to the NAIA championships, to the Division III championships, to the Division I championships 4 straight weeks. I was home 6 days the month of March. That's when the hangover hits in.
Right.
It's like, it's the hangover is exhausting. It's not like I can't get up because, I tried to balance myself at D2s, D3s, and so I wasn't for the D1s. It's the big one on the schedule. You got to be careful.
It's a credit to you and what your love of the sport and your care of your own performance and work that you're able to do that youth event the following week. I'm just imagining a situation, where Joe Buck goes back to Class A the week following the World Series or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, there's just got to be, I would think, an internal difference in the mindset approaching an event. While you still want to deliver a great performance because you care about your own work, that's still got to be a change in the level of the mindset to a degree.
Yeah, the worst part about it, I think, is I would love to announce every weekend of the year, but let's be honest, I'm married, I've got 2 children, and while my wife is a saint, like as we record this, she's feeding 2 kids upstairs that are going to be 5 and about to be 1. So me being gone for 3 and 4 days at a time on a tournament, or in case of this year, I have 4 more international trips where I'm doing broadcaster PA for 10 days at a time. So from now until mid-September of 2017, I'm out of the country for 40 days. Now, So there are times where there's an event you want to announce, and your wife and your family have made those sacrifices because they know you're passionate about what you're doing. My wife loves the fact that I'm passionate about wrestling and announcing. And, for her, it's kind of cool to be like, hey, look, there's my husband on TV. But I still have to say no. And sometimes you don't want to say no, and sometimes you have to. Like that youth event, I was actually filling in because the buddy of mine who announced the NCAA championships with, he was going to be in a wedding. And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll do it because, Hazard can't make it. Frank, I'll come up and announce your tournament for you. And come to find out, that tournament director had both guys who announced the NCAA championships at his middle school and high school tournament, in a preseason. So sometimes things, you got to say no. You can't always, and thing is, there's the point is, if you have to say yes, you've also got to be, people have got to understand that at a certain level, you're going to have to pay a little higher than what you would expect to get from, the teacher that likes wrestling in your school and stuff, It's not like I'm saying, I can raise my rates because I've done the NCAA championships or the Olympics. No, there's a value to what PA announcers do in every sport. Wrestling's a little behind on understanding what that value is. So there's certain price points. I won't leave the house if I don't make X amount per day and it makes it worth my while, I'll have to probably decline it. And that's the worst part, because I want to say yes to everybody. Right. But if I were single, I probably would. But guess what? If I say yes to everybody, I will be single.
Well, I think the biggest thing we've got to take away from this conversation, Jason, is thank God you're married.
Oh my goodness! If it was not for Abby Loss Bryant and my two little girls, Lucy London and Ruby Rio, yes, there is a theme there.
Nice.
I do not know where I'd be, because I get jacked up. You can hear how excited and animated I get. This is me on message boards when people are being stupid, and I want to be like, "You're an idiot," She's like, and she'll hear the typing. It's like, "What are you typing? This guy's an idiot." Stop. It's like that picture that goes around. What are you doing? Somebody's wrong on the internet. I'm that guy. I'm that impulsive guy, and thankfully for her and for me and our marriage, she's really kept me in a grounding presence in that respect. It doesn't mean I don't do it when she's gone sometimes, but yeah, if it wasn't for her, Matt Talk wouldn't be back in its current iteration. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to, if I was in a 9-to-5 job, like, I don't want to be, I wouldn't have these opportunities. And because I was smart enough to say Abby from St. Paul, say yes to an eHarmony invite that says Abby from St. Paul requests communication. Oh man, all of it, again, the domino effect, man.
Well, all of it has come together into a package of podcasting, of podcast networks, sports broadcasting, PA announcing, journalism, all kinds of stuff that there's so many things in sort of your body of work and your background we didn't even touch on, Jason, but there's so much more out there. But the most important thing is that if there's a wrestling fan hearing this conversation at this point and they want to check out what it is that you do in any of the multiple iterations between Matt Talk Online, shows you host, affiliate shows, part of the network, how can they find Matt Talk Online and yourself on the socials?
It's matttalkonline.com is the website. I'm more prevalent on Twitter at Jason M. Bryant. I actually got the blue check mark now, so you can see that. I'm really happy about that. The Matt Talk Online Twitter account's not super active just because it's pretty much me reposting the same stuff that I would on my page. So at Jason M. Bryant on Twitter. Matt Talk Online is on Facebook. I float around. I don't do a whole lot on Instagram with or Snap, or the Snapchats of the Instagrams for the kids. Basically, if you're following me on my personal account on Facebook, you're going to get links to my shows and pictures of my kids. So not a whole lot of interaction there, but yeah, Twitter is really the place that I kind of live. And Facebook, the fan page at Matt Talk, facebook.com/Matt Talk Online, and those are where you find it. I'm very accessible. I have open DMs, so I don't have to be following you for you to DM me if you've got a question about wrestling. I've got a lot of questions from people about podcasting. I know there's sports information directors having their conference down in Orlando right now. There was a panel on podcasting down there. I was wanting to do that for years. I could never make it. And then I've already gotten an email like, "Hey, what would you think about a team doing a show?" I go, "Funny you mentioned that because I've got your product." But yeah, matttalkonline.com, at Jason M. Bryant. Hit me with a follow. If you're into, I'm into goofy movies and funky stuff. I listen to podcasts about podcasting, with your show and, the feed and, Spreaker Live Show, all the things that Dave Jackson does. So those names, if they're familiar to you, I'm usually in those spaces and I'm not hard to find. So that's the long, short, whatever version of the pitch.
You were a fellow co-host of an hour on International Podcast Day last year, and if I remember, you were a last-minute fill-in, if I remember correctly. So we were on the same agenda last fall, and who knows what will happen this September. But either way, folks, Jason Bryant has, if you are a wrestling fan in any way, shape, or form, you owe it to check out his website and at least give him a follow. And there's probably something he's got in repertoire that's going going to interest you, current or back catalog. And it's probably safe to say that if you're sitting at a school right now and you don't believe your school has a wrestling podcast, you probably should reach out to Jason. Is that right?
Yeah, because even if you're not going to use my service that I provide for these, mainly it's geared toward college teams and organizations. But if you want to start a show and you've got questions, fire me. I mean, I've even competitors I've even helped that because of the 40 shows in the space. Yeah, half of them are on my network, but most of those people have reached out to me. Hey, how did you do that? Who did you do this with? Like, what did you do there? How did you set up your show art? What about SoundCloud? And things. What Blue Yeti? Blue Snowball? All those things. All the bad advice that they hear. I'm like usually I'm big into not standards and practices, but yeah, I guess standards and practices or best practices is what I'm really into. So even if you don't use me for what you want to get out of it, I will gladly just kind of lead you down the right direction. And if you want to use somebody else, great. But simple things like hosting, what mics to use, if you've got a little bit of money to spend, on getting an H5 or an H6, or if you're doing it through Skype or Ecamm call recorder, any of that type of stuff, I offer that type of information for free because I get the questions. I'm the guy in wrestling that does the podcast. So
perfect.
It's going to be fairly uniform. I mean, I'm not charging people for it. I mean, if they want to donate and contribute to the Patreon campaign for that, I'm not going to say no. Awesome. So it's just, by the way, Dan, I want to say I've contributed to the Podcast Digest on Patreon, and because I enjoy the show, and I encourage you, if you listen to the show because you're on long drives or you're interested in podcasters, or you see the people that Dan, you've got an impressive list of people that have been on this program. I would encourage you to check out the Patreon campaign for the Podcast Digest, because I've been contributing, and it's not like it's like a whole lot. It's not like I'm like, here, Dan, here's $100 a month. It's a couple bucks.
You've been on the show a long time ago, Jason, if that was the case.
Yeah, that's actually one of my deals. If you're a $20 Patreon contributor, you actually get to co-host a show with me.
I was going to say, if you were contributing at that level, you could have had the extra bedroom in my house. There's a lot more than just being on the show we could have worked out. But I appreciate the kind words, Jason, as well. And folks, links to everything Jason and I have been talking about are in the show notes, as always. And one last thing to do, Jason Bryant, thank you very much for taking the time to join me, sir.
My pleasure, sir.
And folks, that will do it for episode 147 of the Podcast Digest. My conversation with Jason Bryant, Matt Talk Online. What'd you guys think? You may not be huge into wrestling, but I hope you enjoyed the conversation from sort of a podcasting kind of realizing your dreams, working to achieve it type angle. It was super intriguing to me. I'm not that big into wrestling, but I am that big into Jason's story, which I think was pretty darn amazing, if you ask me. So if you did enjoy that conversation, do me this one favor. Tell a friend about it in person, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever it is, the platform that you love to tell people about stuff that you think is awesome. Tell it right there. Or if you don't talk to people or something, an iTunes review would be spectacular. Guys, I really feel like I'm sort of a little bit hurting in the iTunes review category. That would be amazing. I know so many of you out there love this show and love what I do, and a quick iTunes review really would mean a lot. So in the meantime, folks, I want to let you know that more great stuff is coming. It is, and I appreciate your patience. So if you did enjoy this week's show, please tell a friend. Before I leave you, though, I want to take just a quick moment, thank this week's show sponsor. That is my friends at Podbean, podbean.com/TPD. It'll get you your first month of podcast hosting and monetization services for free, and give you more information about the great service that they offer. So once again, my thanks to Podbean for always supporting the Podcast Digest. Those guys have been so good to me for so long, just like you've been so good to me for so long. Thank you for sharing the show. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I know this was a long episode, so I'm going to get out of here and allow you to get to the next show in your queue. But I will be back again next week. I'm not sure exactly what you'll hear next week. We will figure that out shortly. It may be a flashback episode, my fancy name for a replay, or maybe a solo where I'll just talk to you for a little bit about what's going on, because there's a lot going on in my personal/professional day job life. Maybe I'll share a little bit of that next week. We'll see. Until then, for the Podcast Digest, my name's Dan Lizette.